The first thing my therapist ever said to me was not what I expected. I had been sitting in her office for 11 minutes on a gray couch that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, arranged in the particular way I had arranged myself for difficult conversations my whole life, spine straight, hands in lap, expression calibrated to competent and fine. I had summarized, in the efficient way I summarized things, the basic contours of why I was there. Dr. Anku looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "You described all of that without once referring to how it made you feel. You described events. You described other people's behavior. You never once said I felt." I looked at her. "I know," I said. "That's where we'll start," she said. That was 3 years before the court. 3 years before a family court judge in a beige courtroom asked questions that required answers. And the answers that came from me, from Dr. Anku's clinical documentation, from 2 other witnesses who had known my mother and me across different chapters of our shared history, assembled into a picture that my mother sat across the room and watched be assembled without being able to stop it. 3 years is a long time. It is also when you have spent 34 years learning, not to say I felt not very long at all. Let me tell you how I got there. The laugh happened on a Sunday in March, 2 months before I walked into Dr. Anku's office for the first time. I had been working up to saying it for 3 weeks. I had written it in my journal first, the private one, the one that lived in the drawer of my nightstand under a book I had not read, because I had learned over years that things I wasn't sure I was allowed to say needed to be tested privately before they could survive a conversation. I had written, "I think I need to talk to someone, a professional. I think something is wrong, and I cannot find the bottom of it by myself." I had read it back several times. It had seemed true. I had called my mother that Sunday because I called her every Sunday, and because I had decided, in the particular way I made decisions back then, optimistically without sufficient data, that she was someone I could tell. She was making tea when I said it. I heard the kettle in the background. I said that I had been struggling for a while with some things, and that I was thinking about starting therapy. The laugh was not loud. That is the thing about my mother's most effective expressions. They were never loud. They were precise. The laugh was 3 syllables, light and dismissive. The laugh that said, "Oh, you." And then she said, "Therapy. Honestly, Zola, you've always been so sensitive. Mom, you know what therapy is? It's paying someone to agree with everything you say. You don't need that. You just need to toughen up a bit. You've been like this since you were small. Everything was always very big for you. Everything was always very big for you." Said in the tone of a flaw, a diagnosis delivered with the certainty of someone who had been observing the condition for 34 years and had formed a complete view. I said, "Okay, Mom." I changed the subject. We talked about something else. I said goodbye. I hung up. I sat in my apartment for a long time. And then I called the therapy practice I had already researched and made the appointment I had already decided to make. And I noted, in the quiet way I noted things, that the conversation had given me more information than I had expected. I am a child and family social worker. I have been doing this work for 8 years in a county department that handles the cases no one finds straightforward. Families in crisis, children in complicated situations, the slow and difficult work of assessing environments and making recommendations and trying to get decisions right when the cost of getting them wrong is borne by people who didn't choose their circumstances. I say this because the irony of it has never been lost on me. I have spent 8 years being trained and practiced in the recognition of emotional dynamics in families. I know the vocabulary. I know the literature. I can identify in a family I am assessing the patterns of behavior that indicate control, the communication styles that undermine the development of autonomous identity in children, the subtle and not so subtle ways that love and power become confused in family systems. I can see all of this clearly in other people's families. This is not unusual. The professional literature is full of practitioners who work in helping fields and maintain, for years and sometimes decades, a managed unawareness about their own histories. The mechanisms of that unawareness are not stupidity or hypocrisy. They are the ordinary human capacity for compartmentalization, for the story about your own life that holds together because you have been telling it since childhood, and the alternatives are too disorienting to entertain. My story said, my mother was particular. She had high expectations. She expressed love in exacting ways. My story said, I was sensitive as a child. Things were big for me. I learned to manage this. Both of these things were true. What was also true, what I had not let into the story, was the cost of the managing. The specific weight of spending 34 years making myself smaller, quieter, more contained, more competent, more fine. The way I had learned to not say I felt because feelings were the evidence of sensitivity and sensitivity was the flaw, and the flaw needed to be hidden or corrected or apologized for. Dr. Anku found all of this in the first 3 sessions. Not by telling me, by asking questions and waiting the way good therapists wait, not for the prepared answer, but for the one that comes from somewhere below the preparation. I want to tell you what therapy was specifically because my mother had described it as paying someone to agree with you, and I want the record to reflect how completely wrong that was. Dr. Anku did not agree with me. She challenged me regularly with a precision that I recognized from my own professional practice. The specific challenge that does not attack but holds a mirror still and waits for you to look at what's in it. She pushed back on my framings. She named things I had been calling by other names. She returned repeatedly to the same territory. You said what happened. You didn't say how it landed. Tell me how it landed. It was the hardest work I had done in my adult life. I am not being dramatic when I say that. I have worked through difficult cases professionally, stayed in difficult situations beyond what was comfortable, made recommendations that were right and hard, and cost me something. That work was hard. This was harder, because the cases in my professional life were not about me. And this was entirely about me. And I had spent 34 years developing an intricate architecture of not about me, and dismantling it turned out to require the same deliberate patience as any other structural work. 6 months in, Dr. Anku said, I'd like to talk about the concept of emotional control. In the context of what you've described about your early family environment, I said, I know what that term means professionally. I know you do, she said. I'm asking you to apply it personally. I sat with that request for a long time in that session. Then I started to talk. I have a daughter. Her name is Adaeze. She is 7 years old. She has a laugh that I would describe, if I were being precise about it, as structural. It comes from somewhere in her chest, and it moves through everything in the room. She is opinionated and particular, and when she is sad, she wants to be held, and she says so plainly without embarrassment, which I have worked consciously and consistently to make possible for her. She is the reason the court happened, not because she was in danger. I want to be clear about that immediately because the word court in the context of a child carries implications I need to address directly. Adaeze was not in danger. She was and is a child who is loved and attended to and developing well in every measurable way. She is the reason the court happened because my mother decided, when Adaeze was 5, that she wanted more access than I was comfortable with. And when I set limits, specific, considered clinical limits based on what I was observing and what I knew from my professional experience, my mother chose to pursue those limits through the legal system. A grandparent access petition. In our state, grandparents have the right to petition for court-ordered visitation under specific circumstances. My mother filed one. She filed it 18 months into my therapy. I believe she expected it to be straightforward, that the court would see a grandmother who wanted to be close to her grandchild and a daughter who was being, the word she used in the initial filing, unreasonably restrictive. What she did not account for was what 18 months of therapy had given me. Not bitterness, not a case built on grievance, something more precise and more durable, the ability to say I felt, the ability to name what had happened in my own history with specificity, and without the apology I had always attached to my own perceptions, the ability to sit in a room and tell the truth about my childhood and the dynamics within it without the instinct to immediately soften it into something more comfortable for the person it implicated. My mother had spent 34 years training me to soften things. Therapy had given me back the unsoftened version. Her name was Patience. I do not know if her parents had prophetic instincts or simply liked the name, but she was, as it turned out, precisely that. I sat in her office 3 days after my mother filed the petition, and I told her everything, not the summary, not the managed version, the full account, childhood, adulthood, the laugh on the Sunday in March, the therapy, the patterns I had identified and named and understood. I spoke for 90 minutes without stopping, and Patience took notes without interrupting. And when I finished, she looked up from her legal pad and said, "You've already done the work." "I've been in therapy for 18 months. I said, "I mean, you've already named it. Clearly, consistently, with appropriate specificity. That's unusual. Most people come in with the feeling, but not the framework. You have both." She told me what the proceeding would look like. Grandparent access cases, she explained, required the court to assess the best interests of the child, but they also required examination of the relationship between the grandparent and the child's parent, the nature of it, the history, the reasons the parent had for the limits they had set. My reasons, she said, were going to be central. She asked if Dr. Anku would be willing to provide documentation. I called Dr. Anku that afternoon. Dr. Anku said, "I'll prepare what you need." Dr. Anku's documentation was 41 pages. I did not read all of it before the hearing. Patience advised me not to. She said that reading clinical documentation about yourself immediately before giving testimony was counterproductive, that it could make you perform the content rather than speak from it, and that speaking from it was what the court needed. What I knew from the sections she walked me through was this: 41 pages of careful, clinical, precisely sourced documentation describing the therapeutic work of the previous 2 years, the presenting issues, the patterns identified, the terminology. And here was where my professional vocabulary became something other than irony, where it became useful in exactly the way irony sometimes resolves into the clinical terminology applied, not to a family I was assessing professionally, but to the family I had come from. Emotional control, defined, evidence documented. The laugh in March was in there, not as the central exhibit. It was one data point among many. What was central was the pattern, the consistency of it, the specific way that my mother's management of my emotional expression had operated, documented session by session, across the full length of my therapeutic work. Patience also had 2 other witnesses. My father. My parents had divorced when I was 12, who had remained at a careful distance from family dynamics for 20 years, but who agreed, when asked directly, to be honest about what he had observed during the years of the marriage. He was not hostile to my mother. He was precise. He used the phrase she needed to be the authority on what was real and left it to stand without elaboration. And my aunt, my mother's sister, who surprised me. She called me the week before the hearing. She said, "I want to testify. If you'll let me." I said, "You don't have to." "I know," she said, "but I've watched your mother manage you for 30 years, and I have never said anything about it. And I would like to say something now, while it's useful." The courtroom was smaller than I expected, not a dramatic space, a functional room in a family court building that smelled like any institutional building, coffee and carpet, and the specific neutrality of a place designed to process important things efficiently. The judge was a woman in her 50s named Judge Calloway, who had the energy of someone who had heard many versions of many family stories and was not easily surprised. My mother sat across the room with her attorney. I had not seen her since I set the limits, 7 months earlier. She looked the same, composed, the specific composure she always carried, the composure I had spent my professional career learning to recognize as a style rather than a state, the managed surface of someone who needed to be seen as the reasonable party. I was called first. Patience had prepared me for this in the specific way good preparation works. Not by scripting answers, but by ensuring I knew that I was allowed to take time, allowed to say I need a moment, allowed to correct a mischaracterization without becoming defensive. She had said, "You know this territory professionally. Apply that knowledge to yourself. You are the expert on your own experience." I sat in the witness stand, and I answered questions for 90 minutes. I told the truth, not the managed version, the full version. I spoke about my childhood with the specificity that Dr. Anku had spent 2 years helping me build, not as accusation, not with the emotional volatility that my mother had always identified as my sensitivity, but with the calm precision of someone who had done the work of understanding what had happened and could describe it in language that was accurate without being cruel. I said I felt 31 times. I counted, afterward, 31. Each one was true. My mother's attorney cross-examined me. He used the word sensitive twice. He suggested I was overinterpreting normal parenting. He asked whether I wasn't simply passing on my own issues to my daughter by restricting her grandmother's access. I looked at him. I have spent 8 years professionally assessing family dynamics. I said, I have applied the same clinical framework to my own history that I would apply to any family in my caseload. My assessment is not based on sensitivity. It is based on evidence and pattern. I can speak to both. He moved on. My aunt was the last witness. She is 62 years old, my mother's older sister, and she sat in that witness stand with the particular stillness of someone who has decided to say a true thing and is no longer afraid of what it costs. She spoke for 40 minutes. I will not reproduce all of it. It is not mine to reproduce entirely, and some of it belongs to the private architecture of a family I was part of but did not wholly see. What I will tell you is the moment the room changed. The judge had asked my aunt to describe, specifically, what she had observed about my mother's management of my emotional expression as a child. My aunt said, "My sister loves her daughter." I want to say that clearly first because it is true and because what I'm about to say exists alongside it and not instead of it. She paused. My sister needed Zola to be fine. That was the operating requirement. Zola was required to be fine, to manage her own emotional states privately and quickly, to present as composed. When she was not fine, when she cried, when she was frightened, when she expressed distress of any kind, my sister experienced it as a problem, as a failure. And the response to that failure was not comfort. It was correction. Zola was told she was too sensitive. She was told she was making things bigger than they were. She was told, in various forms and across years, that her feelings were errors to be corrected rather than information to be heard. The room was very quiet. I watched this for 30 years. My aunt said, I never said anything because I told myself it was not my family, not my child. I am saying something now because Zola has a daughter who laughs with her whole body and who says I'm sad when she is sad without apologizing for it. And I believe that is something Zola built deliberately. And I believe it deserves to be protected. She looked at the judge. Whatever you decide about visitation, that is your decision. But I want the court to understand that the limits Zola has set are not the behavior of an overreacting daughter. They are the considered choices of a woman who understands from the inside and from her professional training what certain environments do to children, and who has decided that her daughter will grow up in a different one. I was looking at the table in front of me while she spoke. When she finished, I looked up. My mother was looking at her sister. Her composure, which had been in place all morning, had something in it now that I could not quite name, not quite cracked, not quite intact, something in between. The expression of a person watching a picture of themselves assembled from pieces they had not assembled themselves, and finding the picture accurate in ways they had not anticipated. The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then Judge Calloway said, "Thank you. We'll take a short recess." The ruling came in two parts. The first part granted a limited visitation schedule, supervised, structured, with specific parameters around communication and duration, not the access my mother had petitioned for, not the nothing she had feared I wanted, something in between, calibrated, the kind of ruling that says both things are real, and here is what that means in practice. The second part was the part that mattered most to me, though it was the less dramatic of the two. Judge Calloway said, in her summary, that the testimony had established a pattern of emotional management in the parent-child relationship that the court took seriously. She said the parent's professional background gave additional weight to her assessment of the environment she wished to create for her daughter. She said the limits set were consistent with a considered and evidence-based approach to protecting a child's emotional development. She said the word considered. I had been called sensitive my whole life. A judge had called my choices considered. I sat with that for a moment. My mother called me 6 weeks after the ruling. She called on a Sunday, which was when she always called, in the time slot she had always used, as if the structure of Sunday calls could hold something that had fundamentally changed its shape. I answered. She did not open with the ruling. She opened with the weather, with a recipe she had made, with the ordinary furniture of a Sunday call. I let her use it for a while. Not unkindly. I was genuinely interested in the weather and the recipe, in the ordinary way that you are interested in ordinary things. Then she said, the supervision. The first session is next week. Yes, I said. I'd been thinking about what your aunt said. I waited. She wasn't wrong, my mother said. The words came out differently than I had ever heard her words come out. Compressed, slightly, as if the getting out of them had required something. I know, I said. I didn't, she stopped. I didn't understand that what I was doing was a thing being done. I thought I was helping you manage yourself. I know, I said again. Is that enough? To say that? I thought about the question with the honesty it deserved. It's a beginning, I said. I don't know yet what comes after it. I think we find out slowly. She was quiet. The therapy, she said. I laughed. Yes. That was wrong. Yes, I said. It was. The call went on for 20 more minutes. It was not resolved. It was not clean. It was a conversation between two people who shared a long, complicated, painful history and who were tentatively trying to find out what they were to each other when the history was no longer hidden. I do not know what we will be. I know what I am building in the meantime, for Adaeze, for myself, in the specific, determined, daily way you build things that matter. A house where I'm sad is allowed, where I felt is information and not failure, where feelings are not errors to be corrected, but whether to be moved through, named, and released. Adaeze told me last week, at dinner, that she had been angry at a friend at school and had told the friend so, and the friend had said sorry, and they had kept playing. She told me this the way she tells me most things, matter-of-factly, as a simple report from the ongoing project of her life. Good, I said. That's exactly right. She went back to her dinner. I sat across from her and thought about the gray couch and the question I had not been able to answer, and the 3 years between that question and this table, and what it cost and what it built. Tell me how it landed. Here is how it landed. Like a door I had been standing outside of my whole life, finally opened. Like the first breath after a long-held one. Like my daughter at dinner telling me a simple, true thing about her day. Unafraid. Like enough.